Alrighty, welcome everyone to today's webinar where I'll be quickly running you through the zone of proximal development, what is commonly referred to as the ZPD. And for whatever reason, I quite often write that as ZDP, but if you ever see me do that, then that's just a mistake. Now, the zone of proximal development, I sort of pair it up with some of the other quote-unquote advanced strategies that really scare people, like cognitive load theory, serial position effect, etc. But it's actually quite simple. It basically means that there's kind of a level of difficulty where it's not too hard but not too easy for a particular student. And that's the point at which you want to direct your teaching towards. So if, for example, you've got, let's try and demonstrate this in a few different ways. Now, if you've got, say, 5 particular levels, and quite often inside each of those levels, you'll have 3 sub-levels. Maybe we're talking about reading here, it could be a writing task or whatever. Then you need to accurately figure out, I like to use the word diagnose, specifically where students are here. And the zone of proximal development might say, for example, let's use a different pen, that a student is functioning at this particular level here when they are provided support by someone who is more knowledgeable than them. Now, that in this particular concept is called an MKO, which stands for a more knowledgeable other. And just quickly, the zone of the proximal development comes from, well, it's about 100 odd years old. And it comes from, I think he's Russian, might be Ukrainian or something. A lot of these really old strategies that are still around now, theories or whatever, a lot of them tend to come from places like Russia and Ukraine and things. I don't know why that is. But anyway, I think his first name is Leo from memory. I could be wrong there, but he's... people commonly refer to him as Vygotsky, and he's got lots of different things. People always talk about Vygotsky in various different ways, like Vygotskyan teaching and strategies and so forth. Let me see if I can spell this. Vygotsky. I may or may not have that correct. I'm going with 70% chance, 80% chance of having that correct. Anyway, so that doesn't matter, and it's about 100 years old. And while we're going through and doing the history lesson, the zone of proximal development is kind of the precursor to that other strategy called scaffolding. And scaffolding was first used as a strategy in the education sort of sense, I think in the late 60s or early 70s or something like that. I can't quite remember. But either way, it's considered to be or spoken about in terms of scaffolding as well. But there was a huge time difference because even though Vygotskyan teaching has got a lot to do with scaffolding and things, he didn't actually use that terminology back then. It kind of developed later on. Anyway, that doesn't really matter. For those that like their history and to see where these strategies come from, that one's sort of an interesting one because I think it is... Once you start to get used to working with different teaching strategies, the next kind of step is to understand how they relate to other strategies and sort of how long they've been around for and how they've developed over time. Because I think there is there is information that we can glean from that, and it just gives us that extra level of understanding, I guess. But anyway, so let's say in this simple strategy here that there are 5 different levels, and let's say you ping that student at level 3, so they can function at this particular level here. The zone of proximal development is that bit there. Now that is the bit where the student is capable of learning, going through and approaching tasks, trying to solve problems, all this kind of stuff, when they get the help of an MKO. So I don't really like that term, but basically with teacher support, the ZPD, because I always write ZDP, the ZPD is there. Maybe I should have gone like that. That would have been better. The curly braces or whatever it's called. The ZDP is there under the condition that there's an MKO present. So if there wasn't, let's just use the word. No, we'll use the right terminology. Assuming there was a teacher, teacher aide, someone else who knew more than the student, they can function and learn at level 3. right? But if that person wasn't there, or what the student can do on their own is more like level 2. And obviously in this scenario there are various different levels, sub-levels, and I'll explain why that is. That's just something that I like to add in. So the most important, another way I guess of demonstrating this and how I demonstrate it in the book is that you've got 3 sort of circles, I guess, and this isn't exactly how I do it in the book, but the one in the book I'm not overly pleased with. But basically you've got this sort of level here. So say a student's learning trajectory goes like that, right? So this stuff here they already understand really well. So that's a big tick. If you were to do a lesson for this student at this point here that wasn't just a review, they'd probably be bored to tears. That can lead to behavioural problems, and they're really not learning anything. They may be consolidating their knowledge a bit, but that's sort of the limit of it. They're not really getting anywhere. But this bit here is way too hard, just impossible. They can do that on their own. They can't even do that with the help of that MKO. So even if there is a teacher, teacher aide, trainer, whoever here helping them, they just don't have a chance. Any activities, let's say there's 7 activities there, and there's 7 activities there, and there's a bunch in there. They won't be able to do that even with help, and the whole purpose of this is not so much that they won't be able to do it, but they won't be able to learn. They won't be learning anything here because they're just so overwhelmed or stimulated, I guess, from that perspective that nothing really makes sense. It's kind of like if I was chucked into I don't know, even first year, but let's go third year engineering class or something at university. I would just have 0 clue, and I really wouldn't learn anything. At the end, I'd be even more confused and more frustrated, and I might learn a couple of facts, but that would quickly disappear out of short-term memory anyway, and I'd have no clue how to apply it. So realistically, that would not be the right point for me to start. And even then, even with the help of someone here, I'd still have absolutely no chance of achieving anything or learning something. So in terms of the zone of proximal development, that example talks about this particular bit here. But yet, if I was put into a class with a bunch of year 7s to do maths, I'd be somewhere here, and you wouldn't learn anything because you've already covered that knowledge or covered that particular task or activity or concept or whatever. So there's kind of like a sweet spot in the middle where, with the help of someone, that's where the student learns best. And this is the cool thing about where it relates to scaffolding, as I was saying before. Scaffolding happens in here. So at this point here is where you'd probably start the lesson around here. So that's where you're doing some modelling, some worked examples, and your goal is to get the student by the end of the lesson or learning sequence or whatever to this particular point here. So this point here is where they can do, say there's the task there. This point here is where they can do that task individually or independently, sort of on their own. You're not even going to this spot, not even going to there. And maybe here we're doing a little bit of a review because we're taking that information there and we're kind of saying, oh, by the way, this is the stuff we already know. So this is our existing knowledge and our existing capabilities, our existing experience, and we're just linking that. So we're just making that leap because students, again, they don't start at 0. Quite often people make the assumption that there's a 0 starting point when it comes to lesson planning, activity planning, or whatever it is, but that's just not the case. Even if you're circulating in a room and you wander around and help this student for 3 minutes, you never make the assumption they're starting from 0 because they're not. They always have some idea. Even in this example I was talking before about going into an engineering class, well, I mean, I wouldn't have a clue about engineering, but I would know at least something. I know how to do basic graphs. I know a little bit about statistics and data and that kind of stuff. When it comes to engineering, yes, not a clue, but I'm certainly not starting at completely 0. And that applies to every single person watching this video as well. You always have some idea. You know numbers. You know how to count. There's always something that you bring with you. So it's talking about this sort of learning trajectory that comes along in this direction, starting at this point here, and this is where you need to accurately diagnose specifically where students are at so that they're at that right level, because you don't want to accidentally start the lesson there but you don't want to start it here. You don't want to start it here, or you can to do a quick little review. You want to start it on that exact point. That's usually the average of your class, by the way. So your class is here. You differentiate a little bit in either direction to provide a lesson sort of there. And then here's where your remedial students are, or your interventions happen over here. Here's probably your gifted and talented or accelerated students are at that sort of point. Now I'm just drawing stuff everywhere, so I'll change pens. But anyway, you can see how here we have to do a bunch of scaffolds to be able to get the student from that point across to that point. Now to do that, we'll do a little introductory type thing there, review, link it through here and so forth. And then we'll do, say, individual work, pair and group work, some type of game or activity. And we're slowly purposeful practice or deliberate practice, spaced learning, all this kind of stuff. And we're slowly pushing them in the direction until we get to here. And then therefore, with the help of a teacher or teacher aide or trainer or whoever, and all these different scaffolds, different types of resources and ways of explaining it and etc., we finally got them to this point where they are at the end of that particular cycle, I guess you could say. Now, this is just how I explain it. If you actually read any either commentary or analysis of zone and proximal development, you'll find that this is just complete garbage. But I explain it in I didn't want to rub that off, actually. I explain it in certain ways that just make sense to me. But as a broad concept, that's the whole idea behind the zone of proximal development. Now, just to do this in a slightly neater way. Okay, so now we're making that assumption again that we're doing scaffolds in here and the student needs to go from that point to that point. Two other things that I just want to say about this, and I'll wrap this one up because I don't want to spend too much time here. If we're starting a student here and getting it to there, what that means is that, or there's another way to think of this, is that there is kind of subsections. So see how I've got 1, 2, 3 in each of those? And the reason I did that is because students don't all start at that exact point. Obviously there's a range and sometimes they pick things up really quick. So even within that sort of range, if you can accurately diagnose specifically where a student's at for a certain topic or concept or whatever, then, well, you're doing really well, because that's a very difficult thing to do. And again, that's the point at which we aim classes at and group work and things like that. And then we differentiate out in a different direction. Most people differentiate in that way. I think we should differentiate in both ways because it's important in a developmental curriculum to look after all of your students and to give everyone equal opportunity to learn and improve. So anyway, so we're at this point here. Now some students are going to be here, some students are going to be there, some students are going to be there. So that's the 1, 2, 3. Some are going to be here, some are going to be here. So you just got to bear that in mind as well. Now the one other thing that I was going to say is that students actually, yes, they get to here, but this is kind of, in a way, a moving target as well. So once they've got to this point here, if they start here, then you might be aiming to get them, well, it doesn't really make sense because this is the bit here that they can't achieve. But if they're starting further towards here, then they're going to get this point a lot quicker. So then they're going to be able to be accelerated a little bit or to do more advanced stuff that's kind of bridging in this direction. So that's where you're getting self-directed learning and so on and so forth happening. But that particular student's circle is actually more like that, in that sort of sense. So you've just done some differentiation to move the circle in that way or move the circle in that little bit. So they're sort of starting here and moving to there, whereas this student is starting there and moving to there. So it's kind of a moving beast. And what the other thing that also happens is once that student gets to there and achieves it, then it kind of resets itself, right? So then they start a new one of these. And then again, they start here and then move across to here. So this also applies, by the way, in terms of a single activity, a whole class that goes for a day or for an hour or whatever, also for a lesson, and sorry, not for a lesson, also for a sequence of lessons or over a period of time. So it could be a unit of work or an entire course or an entire degree or an entire academic year or whatever. Either way, that period there is kind of like a graphic representation of everything from the bigger, higher order, longer periods of time that we plan for, right through to the smaller periods of time for when you're going and helping one student for 3 minutes. You're figuring out where they're up to, what you can do, what scaffolds you can put in place to get them to that other end so that it can then restart over here. This point here, by the way, is where your goals are, and you'll have either what I call micro goals or progress milestones or something along those lines throughout there as they move across. So that's another how that sort of fits into that process. But mainly your goals are at the end here before it then resets or you start again. And then of course you're showing students here what they did there before they sort of start that next circle, if that makes sense. So it's a little bit of a concept, maybe an awkward concept for some people to understand, but basically the whole point of the zone of proximal development was that people were starting to realise, researchers were starting to realise that there are certain, how learning happens, I guess, and how it works, not just physiologically, but psychologically. It's what we call educational psychology. It's an area of study that started looking at way back when how people learn and how people acquire knowledge and acquire concepts and so on and so forth. So these types of things do help us understand more modern strategies as well, like scaffolding and so forth. So I like to graph them and draw them in these types of ways. I'm sure if Fagozzi was alive and had a look at that, he'd probably fall off his chair, but it does help me explain it and understand it in a way that makes sense to me so that I can actually use it in the real world. Because for me, as someone who teaches real live human beings, I need to be able to take these concepts and apply them in that way. And not only that, but explain to other people how they can apply them to year 1 students, to year 7 students, to year 12 students, to adults or whatever. And you need to do exactly the same. So you need to be able to look at these strategies and think, well, I don't like that part of it, I like that part of it, and this is how I'm going to apply it. Because at the end of the day, that's what it's there for. Don't think of it like it's some complicated, aloof, difficult thing that only researchers and academics who have got the time and energy to read these books that are 100 odd years old. No, that's not the case at all. It's there for us in the real world to be able to apply it and to be able to help students. And at the end of the day, every single strategy I talk about has this as its central theme: helping kids reach their goals. That's the most important part. So just remember the most basic, simple strategies like say modelling, shared and guided learning and so forth, scaffolding, which actually are just as complicated when you think about it as these more advanced strategies anyway. They all have one thing in common: they help students achieve goals. So as teachers or teacher aides or other educational professionals, that is the main focus. And whenever you're talking about anything in education, always remember, how can this be used to help students to achieve their goals? So that is my take on the zone of proximal development.